Sorry, getting messages I don't normally get. So I am going to start a new series with you. It's actually a series that I had thought I would start earlier in the month. And I'm going to do it in a way that at the same time synthesizes a fair number of things happening in the news in the week since we last spoke. It's been a week dense with news, but tries to tie it into broader issues. And so the series is going to be on making democracy work better. And I'm going to come at that from a few different angles. As you can see, a philosophical angle. What is it that leads us to be attracted to democracy, to put some faith and stock in democracy in the first place? And I have certain images from the founding of our Constitution through the important civil rights politics of the 1950s and 1960s, and the expansion and increasing realization of the aspirations that were articulated at the founding of our society, to I think really wonderful image out of Minnesota of the people voting in the 2022 elections. And I hope you can maybe see the diversity and the ordinariness of people exercising their right to determine who their leaders are going to be and how they are going to hold them accountable for what they do in our name, right? And so that is one set of images, and then there's another set of images here of the invasion of the Capitol on January 6th of 2021, and the, I think, very stark parallel with the Reichstag fire in Germany, the sense of attacking parliament or the legislature in order to attack democracy. And then the caricature, the Halloween image of the Supreme Court, all of which is to say we can juxtapose images of what we admire and hope for from democracy with what we currently see around us, which is democratic dysfunction. And then the question is, can we close the distance? Can we make democracy work better in the 21st century? That's where I want to go. But for today's lecture, I really want to concentrate on what is happening in the world this week as a harbinger of democratic dysfunction. And I'm sorry, it looks like my slide doesn't quite fit together right. American democracy stumbles as the world falters on the brink of polycrises. And I've used this term with you before. I in a sense resist it as a neologism, and I don't like made up words for the most part, but on the other hand, I think it captures something essential about the current world, which is that our crises are not isolated from each other, that they in fact tend to be connected to each other, that a crisis in the House of Representatives with its incapacity to elect a new leader can lead to a crisis in Gaza or Israel or the Ukraine, and that the crisis in Israel or the Ukraine can in turn amplify the crisis in the United States if it emboldens adversaries elsewhere in the world to indirectly or directly interfere with American democracy. And so I think this concept gets at something essential about the contemporary world, which is we cannot treat our crises as isolated or soluble on their own. And so when our democracy stumbles, it holds implications for the rest of the world. As crises mount in the rest of the world, it further challenges our democracy. And so this week is a case in point. And I'm going to start in Congress. And as you are well aware, the Republicans, who are the narrow majority party in the House of Representatives, have a leadership crisis. that is coming up on a month long now, right? It's early October that they lost Kevin McCarthy as their leader. And at the time, in various talks I was giving, I predicted that this might be a very difficult, an intractable problem for the Republicans to solve. And that is in part because, on the one hand, they have a razor thin minority, and on the other hand, they have a deeply fractured caucus, right? And so they have one wing in particular, which, depending on who you talk to, might be called the Freedom Caucus, the Chaos Caucus, the Burn It Down Caucus, right? A group of roughly 20 members of Congress who, many of whom came in on either the Tea Party wave or the Donald Trump wave, and who are anti-institutionalist, populist, highly associated with Make America Great Again, and who are willing to use their power within the caucus, because the caucus relies on their votes in order to be able to function. That gives them power, right, to do outsized mischief. And when I say that, I'm referring to the fact that they don't represent, I think, the dominant view of Republican elected officials or Republican rank and file voters, but nevertheless, they are empowered within their party to bring Make America Great Again, America First, ethno-racial, nationalist ideas to the forefront of the agenda, to demand that the rest of the Republican Party fall in line with them, or else to grind the House of Representatives to a halt. And on the other hand, almost exactly symmetrical, you have 18 Republicans who come from districts that Joe Biden won in the 2020 election, and so who are basically, for their electoral survival, in need of appearing to be more moderate than the Freedom Caucus. And so what we've seen is that Jim Jordan, right, who was the Freedom Caucus's preferred candidate to be the Speaker of the House, was not able to persuade those 20 odd Republicans to come over to his side, and that in the end he lost as opposed to gained support as more and more votes occurred. And then yesterday, in a secret ballot in the caucus by itself, Jordan was removed from the contest for the leadership, at least for the time being. And so we do seem to have a structural impasse. And it seems to me it's not just in the current Congress, in the Congress that was elected in 2022 and will stay in power until the election of 2024. It's not just the fact that they've got this razor thin majority and two mirror image groups within their caucus that have a very hard time cooperating with each other. I seem to have frozen there for a second on my screen. Are you hearing me all right? Can somebody let me know that the transmission is getting through, or if there are problems?
It's getting through fine.
Okay, excellent, good. I get worried when I see it freeze on my end. So this is not just a 2023, 2024 problem, right? And to see that, you can go back to Paul Ryan and John Boehner, as well as Kevin McCarthy, and note that being the Speaker of the House while the Republicans are in control of the House of Representatives has been a thankless task for over a decade now, and that is because the Republican Party, particularly in the House of Representatives, where as a result of gerrymandering and the way in which primary elections work, we get more and more partisan purist members of the House who seem to have, on the one hand, a very strong anti-government ideology. They don't have much interest, much of a substantive agenda for governing. There's not much they want to accomplish. It's part of the reason to come to the third point, that the straw that broke the camel's back for Kevin McCarthy was, on the one hand, that they kept the government open with a continuing resolution as opposed to letting it close in order to further extract leverage. And on the other hand, that McCarthy worked with the Democrats. I want to say inadvertently, by the way. I think the best read of what happened with the continuing resolution that passed a month ago to keep the government open for another 45 days. Note that the clock is ticking down on that. The thing that Boehner did, I'm sorry, that McCarthy did, I believe, was to try to lure the Democrats into voting against his continuing resolution by withdrawing funding for the Ukraine from it. And lo and behold, the Democrats actually swallowed the poison pill, decided to vote for a budget to keep the government open, even without the funding for the Ukraine that Biden was demanding of Congress, is still demanding of Congress as of yesterday, right? That the result was a momentary and perhaps accidental breakout of bipartisanship. And this caucus is so opposed to the other party, views the Democrats as an existential threat to America, and in particular to the standing and status and privilege of the people that they represent, that this was the last straw. They voted to end McCarthy's speakership, throwing the House into a crisis. And by the way, this is not just the doing of an increasingly anti-governmental ideology taking over the Republican Party. It is also a product of the fact that populist, charismatic leadership is increasingly the order of the day for the Republicans. They have become the party of Donald Trump, the party of Make America Great Again. And this is reflected in the fact that Donald Trump, all of his legal troubles notwithstanding, we'll get into that in a moment, remains the prohibitive frontrunner to get the nomination for the party. People who are very much cast in his mold, but who do not command the personal loyalty of his followers, are floundering in the Republican primaries. And so a party that is in the grips of charismatic leadership, that is populist and anti-governmental, is a very difficult party to organize into a governing coalition, into a responsible legislative caucus. And so it's not just, right, the 2023 problem. It's a deeper, decades-long problem with the Republican Party that is now letting our government grind to a halt. I want to say, in the background of all of this, and please note that Jim Jordan was Trump's preferred candidate. He got, despite the fact that he is, on the one hand, the most ideological extreme member of Congress on many metrics, or among them at least, and on the other hand, someone who has almost no positive legislative accomplishments in a considerable length of time in Congress. All of his so-called accomplishments are primarily in the realm of creating problems, legislating, not in legislating itself. It's a sign of the degree of lack of governance or lack of interest in governance on the part of the Republican Party that Jim Jordan got so close to being Speaker of the House and may still be resurrected in future votes. But having said all of that, the fact that Jim Jordan was Donald Trump's preferred candidate, I think, is the best way to explain the improbable rise of Jordan in the House leadership contest, and the fact that Trump knew that Jordan would reliably pursue impeachment proceedings and investigations against Joe Biden, despite the fact that so far the stalled and apparently abortive impeachment investigation into Biden has been a fiasco. Has by the account of the staff running the investigation for the Republicans, not delivered anything that it was supposed to deliver. But nevertheless, right? And here I think we have to recognize the moment that we're working in. It is to Donald Trump's advantage that those investigations continue, because the sheer fact that they continue gives grist to the right-wing media ecosystem to, I'm going to call it a mill, I'll call it an ecosystem, whatever, to continue to amplify the idea that it's not Donald Trump who's in legal trouble. It's not Donald Trump who is corrupt. It's Joe Biden and the Biden crime family, right? And the other thing I think that accounts for Trump's strong backing of Jordan is that Jordan would double down on defunding American support for the Ukraine, and that one of the key dimensions of Biden's leadership is international. And if you can hamstring his capacity to lead in one of the areas that he is, I think, going to most likely trumpet in his campaign, then you are also bolstering Donald Trump's chance to win. And so at this point, the caucus in the House and Donald Trump are working in lockstep to paralyze American politics at a moment of international war and crisis in order to pursue short-term partisan advantage. Now, are the Democrats partially responsible? And in the short term, I want to say yes. And in the long term, I want to say maybe yes as well, right? The Democrats could have voted for Kevin McCarthy. They could have voted present and allowed Kevin McCarthy to remain in power. And frankly, I think the Democrats may very well right now be regretting that they didn't do that, given that we now have chaos in Congress while a crisis is playing out elsewhere in the world, in Israel and Gaza, increasingly threatening to become a regional war in the Middle East, and Biden asking for the aid package that will give him leverage, I hope, or I think we all have to hope, to constrain what could be a catastrophic miscalculation on the part of Benjamin Netanyahu and his government to launch a full-scale ground invasion into Gaza. I'll speak a little bit more about that in a moment, but all that to say, there are much bigger issues at stake at the moment, and having Congress non-functional is making it very difficult for the United States to lead or to have leverage in crises that threaten to spiral out of control and really create conditions for global crisis and war. So maybe the Democrats miscalculated in not voting for Kevin McCarthy, or at least voting present so McCarthy could continue. They have to own that. I see somebody's got their hand raised. Give me just a moment, because I want to say one other thing here, which is that the Democrats actually sent emissaries to McCarthy asking, well, you want to remain leader, we have certain conditions. You have to fund the Ukraine. You probably have to shut down the impeachment inquiry. And by the way, you have to actually fund the government. And if you're willing to make those commitments and do so in a credible way, we will support you. And by the way, the Democratic leadership is saying right now to the Republicans, okay, so you can't get Jim Jordan or Steve Scalise as your leader. You want our help, we will do it, but it has to be with certain conditions: funding for the Ukraine, funding for the US government, funding for Biden's aid package, among them, right? And it seems to me, frankly, that that is the best outcome. I have no idea how probable it is. Okay, so I'm coming out of the slides, and go ahead. I think that's Bob. Is that right? Who had his hand up a moment? Go ahead.
That's me. One of the things I've thought for quite some time is what would happen, or first of all, how can it happen, and what would happen if Hakeem Jeffries was named speaker? You just implied that, oh, maybe a dozen or more Republicans could simply vote present, and that would, given that he has 212, that would make him speaker, I believe. And then if that were the case, how would the power sharing happen? What would happen to committee chairmanships, and so on?
So I suppose this is a technical possibility. I don't think that this is a real possibility, which is to say that the Democrats could control the House while the Republicans have a narrow majority, because you would have to find Republicans willing to vote present. What I was saying was actually the opposite, which is that the Democrats could have voted present, and then McCarthy could have continued as leader. So what I think is more likely, right? So Patrick McHenry of North Carolina with the bow tie is presently the interim leader of the House. Now his job is merely to gavel in the vote for the Speaker of the House. But one of the possibilities is that McHenry could become the Speaker and not the interim leader, right? And if that happened, it would have to happen probably with Democratic support, because the Freedom Caucus would probably not go along with that, right? And so under what conditions, and we could talk about two possibilities here, right? One would be that the Democrats could lead the House with some minimal Republican support, but I don't see that as a realistic possibility. I think the Republican Party is too opposed to the Democrats to have won the majority and allow the Democrats to rule. I think the more likely possibility is that a more moderate Republican could gain the leadership seat with support from the Democrats, which would be anathema to the Freedom Caucus, and with conditions in place for getting that Democratic support. That's really the scenario that I think is the best scenario for the country. Doesn't make it the most likely scenario, but it is I think, more hopeful scenario for coming out of the current impasse and paralysis in the House. Does that make sense, Bob? I recognize you were taking it elsewhere. I don't think that's a genuine possibility right now. You are right. It would only take a handful of Republicans to vote present, but I just can't imagine the scenario in which that actually happens without just open civil war within the House caucus Republicans. House Republicans.
So there's none of them that have any concern about the path of the country and democracy in general or whatever. They're all rabid Trumpites.
I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that. But I think that the path forward is to empower the moderates within the Republican Party within the caucus in the House, and that requires Democratic support. That would be, the so-called adults in the room scenario. I'm going to call it the leadership or the statesmanship scenario. The people in the Republican caucus who recognize that the world is too dangerous right now for Congress to be paralyzed, who therefore want to desperately get past the current impasse, but want to do it without just surrendering, and to be as clear as possible, part of the reason the Democrats didn't support McCarthy 3 weeks ago is because they wanted to expose the chaos, the lack of leadership, the fact that the Republican caucus in Congress does not know how to rule itself, let alone how to legislate for the country, right? So the Democrats have, in a sense, have been happy to step back and let this play out until the Middle East blew up, right? And then all of a sudden it became increasingly obvious, oh, wait, maybe we actually need a functioning legislature in the United States. And so I hope that Jeffries and the more mature and moderate members of the Republican caucus are beginning to consult. My thinking is that it's not going to lead to Jeffries being the Speaker of the House, but to a more moderate Republican getting the gavel with support from some Democrats. That would be the best way out of the current impasse that I can see, best from the perspective of the country, from the perspective of restoring some bipartisan cooperation, without which Congress doesn't work very well, best for managing the crises and providing the president with a little bit more strength, a little bit more leverage as the world goes down some very dark and dangerous alleys. So thank you for the good question, Bob. Anybody else while I'm out of the slides, or shall I jump back in?
Jump.
All right, I'm gonna jump back in. I'm going to conclude my discussion of the partial responsibility for the Democrats and move into the consequences of failure. And I'm focusing exclusively today on the international or global consequences of failure. There are clearly domestic consequences as well. Directly, the federal government employs 3.5 million Americans. Indirectly, maybe as many as 10 million Americans. The federal government provides nutrition and medical assistance to millions of vulnerable Americans. It keeps our national parks open. It copes with national disasters as they unfold and natural disasters as they unfold, and then helps to rebuild communities in the aftermath of hurricanes and fires and floods and tornadoes and all the stuff that nature is throwing at us these days as a result of climate change. And so there's lots domestically important, but at the current moment, I think our focus should really be on the crises around the world. And I want to be as clear as possible. I think Biden's visit to Israel on Wednesday was extremely important, and important in part because of what Biden said. And I think it's been not noted enough, right? He said the United States made mistakes in the aftermath of 9/11, and Israel has just had an attack that psychologically, emotionally is comparable in terms of its impact with the September 11th attacks on the United States. It is tempted at the moment to do more or less what the United States did, which is to launch wars that were in our long-term strategic detriment, to our long-term strategic detriment. And I want to be as clear as possible. I think Joe Biden just said something that no American president really has ever said, which is that the United States made a mistake, in particular in invading Iraq, but perhaps also in invading Afghanistan, in deciding to participate in the politics of regime change rather than in the much more narrow and strategic politics of taking out Al Qaeda in Afghanistan. And in particular, and I think most of this is unsaid and implied, but again, I think it's the first time a president of the United States is admitting that these wars were a mistake, and that's extremely important. And I think really what Biden is saying is that our chief rival and adversary in the region was never Al Qaeda, it was always Iran, and that in particular, the invasion of Iraq strengthened Iran considerably. And in particular, it allowed it to redirect its attention away from protecting its border with Iraq, which had been the site of a couple and long and destructive sustained wars, and into then being much more expansive and aggressive and terroristic in sponsoring Hamas and Hezbollah in, and then we can say Gaza and Lebanon and Yemen and Iraq. So that launching a war because you are injured, because you are angry, because you feel the need to take revenge, or as I suggested last week, because it goes to the very reason of the existence of the state of Israel, right? You can't let Jews be massacred without fighting back, because, right, it is perhaps an existential imperative, right? You've got to show your neighbors that your state is strong enough to defend itself. Yes, those are imperatives. But if that leads you to launch a war that you have no idea what success is, how to exit that war, how to extricate yourself, or what the potential worst case scenarios are. And I want to be as clear as possible. The worst case scenarios here is that you destabilize the states that have recently recognized the existence of Israel, that you have cascading social media catastrophes. I want to go back to my title page here for a second, because I put an image here which I didn't talk about, right? This is part of the news of the week. This is the hospital in Gaza that was bombed, where it appears around 300 civilians, children, women, the elderly, the injured, were sheltering and were ultimately slaughtered, right? And they died awful, grisly deaths. And I chose an image that does not show the graphic violence, but it's aftermath instead, right? Including, I believe that's a child's car seat, but we don't need to dwell on the awful images to know that those awful images ricocheted around the social media platform. There's this saying, right, from Mark Twain, that a lie gets halfway across the world before truth has the opportunity to get out of bed and put its shoes on. And I think part of what's important to recognize is we do not know who was responsible for bombing that hospital. It does appear that there's some credible evidence that it was not the Israelis, but nevertheless, the majority of the Arab world, perhaps the majority of the world, bar none, thinks that Israel bombed that hospital. And if Israel invades Gaza in a full-blown ground invasion, there will be hundreds or thousands of incidents like that, which will be amplified on social media via algorithms, via artificial intelligence, via people whose mission it is to spread disinformation in order to weaken Israel, in order to weaken the West, in order to sow the seeds of discord, and that the result of the Israeli invasion could be the withdrawal of recognition of Israel's right to exist on the part of states that have recently acknowledged its right to exist. Or it could be the toppling of those governments due to insurgency in their own populations who are not on board with recognizing Israel's right to exist. It could be regional warfare with Hezbollah firing the much more advanced weapons that they have at Israel, Israel striking back, Syria, Lebanon getting drawn into the conflict, the United States getting drawn into the conflict. This is the stuff of nightmares. And I want to be as clear as possible. Benjamin Netanyahu, who is the prime minister of Israel, is surrounded by inexperienced, incompetent, right-wing advisors and ministers in his government. It's part of the reason it appears he had to form a government of unity, is to get more experienced people into the room to start planning the war than the coalition which he assembled. And let's be as clear as possible. I think the parallel with the United States is very sharp, that he assembled in order to avoid potential indictment and prosecution and jailing, right? So Netanyahu is holding on to power by assembling a right-wing destructive coalition. We have to rely on that coalition and that unity government being restrained, avoiding an escalatory ground invasion, and pulling back into the more tactical approach that the United States did not take. Go get the hostages, take out Hamas's leadership in surgical strikes, but don't try to occupy Gaza. And by the way, we also have to rely on the restraint of the Iranians in pulling the reins on Hezbollah. How do we do that? Well, we hope that our president and our State Department and our allies have all the leverage that they can use to prevent this crisis from escalating into a full-blown regional war and poly-crisis. Those are the stakes. How do we empower Biden? Well, we stop the infighting in the House of Representatives. We give him some of the support he needs in order to be able to leverage aid packages into concessions from the Israeli government, right? And that is what is at stake. And so back to Bob's question, are there leaders in the Republican Party in the House who can pull back from their, and I'm going to call it narcissistic infighting, right? You know, I'm sorry, it's borderline nihilistic. Who gets to lead the House? Not them, not them. They're so focused on their intra-party, internecine power struggle that they are neglecting the fact that the world is on the brink of something potentially tremendously destructive or even catastrophic. Similarly, right, the Ukrainians, and I don't, you know, I'm on the record as being ambivalent about the support that the United States gives to the Ukraine. I think it might be, unfortunately, the best thing that we can do in the world right now. That in the short term, this is creating all kinds of tension, rivalry, and death. But in the long term, we need to weaken the likes of Putin in order to get to the point where we can begin to cooperate to solve some of our global problems like climate change. Having said all of that, if we pull the plug on aid to the Ukrainians, as they have made minimal but hard-won gains and begun to, I believe, further expose the brittleness of the Russian military and the ineptitude of the Russian regime under Putin, that if we pull the plug now, we give Putin momentum. We give him encouragement to believe that not only is military victory within reach, and to redouble his efforts. You may have seen there was a important Russian offensive launched just 10 days ago. And so the Russians are not by any means merely playing defense at this point, but it also emboldens Putin and other members of the autocratic bloc, especially President Xi of China, to continue to be aggressive, but also to continue to try to undermine the alliance in the democratic world that looks increasingly fragile and dysfunctional. And if, by the way, the United States can't continue to provide aid to the Ukraine or aid to Israel when it is under attack, how reliable is the United States as an ally? If we are not regarded as reliable, how do we lead? And please note, there are many ways in which I'm a critic of the post-Cold War global order, but I think we have to recognize that any order is better than disorder and war, and that the United States has been the anchor as well as the architect of that order. And if we become discredited internationally, not only does, as I'm about to suggest, the idea that democracy is a better system of government than autocracy take a hit, take a blow, it's also the case that the United States and the order that we favor will lose respect, will lose credibility in the world. Now, I'm going to point out, as I have kind of already, that there's something lurking in the background. How did Jim Jordan, right, this unaccomplished radical, get within 20 votes of becoming the Speaker of the House of Representatives? And I think the answer to that is simple and clear. It's because Donald Trump backed him, right? Why did Trump back him? Well, not just because Jordan is a loyalist and Trump could count on him to do his dirty work in Congress, as it appears he may have done on January 6th and continues to do by organizing the impeachment inquiry. But also, I think working in the background of all of this is the idea that Donald Trump's legal fortunes have taken major hits over the last few weeks. And this is not just about Donald Trump. This is then about the strains on our judicial system, on our system for the rule of law, in a country where a third of the people continue to believe that the only reason that Donald Trump is being prosecuted at all is because he stands up for people like them. And so among the things that have happened in the time since we've spoken about this, right, the New York civil suit against the Trump business empire for inflating the value of its real estate and therefore for engaging in tax and business fraud, has actually, right, been the matter of fact in that trial has gone against Trump. The judge on a summary motion has determined, right, that there has been fraud. And so the trial is now entering its penalty phase, and things are not going particularly well for Donald Trump. And again, it's not just about, does Donald Trump actually lose control of the New York portion of his business empire, but also about his public standing. Is he not as successful as a businessman as he has trumpeted himself, as he has advertised himself to be? But in addition to that, right, in the Georgia trial, which I think many people were critical for using RICO, for bringing in 18 different defendants, for its sprawling nature, and therefore the likelihood that it would go on for years and years and years. Lo and behold, there have been 3 convictions in the last couple weeks that have flipped, if you will, the accused into now cooperating witnesses. And Sidney Powell, the lawyer who alleged some of the most outlandish stuff, is now cooperating. Scott Hall, a local operative who with Powell participated in this scheme to get the voting machines to try to demonstrate that there was some kind of fraud. But I think most important is Kenneth Chesebro, right? And he is important because on the one hand, he worked directly and concertedly on the scheme to create false slates of electors. And that is, I think, the core of one of the most important charges of felony fraud against Donald Trump. And now there's somebody at the center of that scheme cooperating with Georgia. And in addition to that, it appears that Chesebro is going to be able to say that he advised Donald Trump that this was probably not a winning legal strategy, but was a good political strategy. At least that's what he's put in emails, and appears to be part of the reason that Fani Willis and her team were willing to give him a quite lenient sentence, despite the fact that he's kind of at the center of one of the main conspiracies, because this takes away one of Trump's central defenses in both Georgia and the federal election trial, which is the advice of counsel defense, that I thought that I was just doing what my lawyers were telling me to do. Now we have one of the main lawyers saying, no, I wasn't telling him that this was the legal and appropriate thing to do. I was telling him that politically, this might be the best way to overturn the election results. Growing bills and strains on the Trump legal team, spending a lot more money than he's taking in right now. And if we look at the way in which things are going in court, it does not appear that very much is going Trump's way in court right now. Now, this is preliminary. The first big trial will almost certainly not begin until March, if it begins then. And so I think we've got to let the legal process play out. But I do think we also have to acknowledge that as the process plays out and as things go more and more against Trump, as it appears they are right now, and that it's likely that they will, that makes Trump more and more dangerous and destructive for American democracy. He is therefore making mischief in the House of Representatives in order to try to make it appear that Biden is every bit as corrupt as he is, or right, take away Biden's strength in foreign policy by hamstringing him with Israel and the Ukraine. And that it doesn't appear to me that, if you want to talk about no adults in the room, that there's any restraint that Donald Trump sees on his struggle for power. He will do things that risk war, that are deeply destructive for the country, in order to win the next election, in order to stay out of jail. And having said all of that, this then returns me to my central topic. How in the world, and again, step back from the, I know, dizzying intensity of contemporary politics, and just ask yourself, closing your eyes and trying to have amnesia over the last 10 years, step behind the veil of amnesia and ask yourself, how can a man facing 91 felony indictments still be the prohibitive frontrunner for the presidential nomination of one of the two main parties in American politics. And I think that helps us to focus on the issue that it's not just Donald Trump, it's not just Jim Jordan, it's not just Kevin McCarthy, it's not just the Republican Party. Though when we start to focus on the Republican Party, our gaze shifts from the personalities and the short-term, immediate political issues into things that are more long-term and structural. The damage to American democracy, and the fact that one of our main two parties is turning into an ethno-racial, traditionalist, populist, increasingly authoritarian party at exactly the moment when the United States is becoming increasingly a multiracial and post-traditional society. Those two are not accidentally related to each other. And please note that our history, and in particular the structures of governance contained in our Constitution, make it very difficult to navigate this transition and are encouraging this development on the part of the Republican Party. And so again, I'm now trying to say, let's not get lost in the incredibly important news of the moment. We are risking war with a Congress that is completely non-functional. Obviously, that is in and of itself something worth dissecting and paying a lot of attention to. But the reason we're there is not to be found in the events of the last week. It is to be found in the Constitution, in the institutions, in the failure of the United States to modernize our democracy and to live up to the demands of the 21st century. And so that's where I want to direct our attention for the remainder of the class today in order to set up what we're going to do in the weeks to come. This is, I think, familiar information. I've spoken with you about it before. That there's a really sharp contrast between the racial demographics of the United States and the partisan composition of the coalition that supports the Republican Party. It has remained a 90% white party. African Americans, Asians, Hispanics all vote dominantly for the Democrats. A substantial plurality of white Americans also vote for the Democratic Party. This puts the Republican Party in a structural bind. It is only getting support from a shrinking constituency. It sees that if it isn't already, it very soon will be a minority party, and yet it doesn't see any way out of the corner it has painted itself into, rather than figuring out how to navigate the difficult transition into being a 21st century conservative party that works for a diverse and post-traditional democracy. The Republican Party, since the Tea Party movement, and especially under Donald Trump's leadership, has become a populist, ethno-racial, traditionalist, authoritarian party. And that makes it incredibly dangerous, not just in its incapacity to rule in Congress or when there's a president elected, but dangerous for our democracy as such. And I'm going to emphasize for a moment where some of the dysfunction in the Republican Party comes from. It comes from the fact that although Americans are, ideologically diverse, right? You know, roughly equal numbers of conservatives and moderates, a substantial portion, though not as large, who are self-described liberals, right? And a Democratic Party that, in a sense, again, mirrors the ideological diversity of the United States, and a Republican Party that is skewed very sharply to the right, that is also, and let me see what I've got coming up here. Let me move here for a second. This is to put the Republican Party in ideological comparative perspective. Where does it fall in terms of its support for liberal democratic principles, norms, and practices? Where does it fall in terms of its support for ethnic minority rights? And to be clear, liberal in this sense is not the political sense, it's the 19th century constitutional sense. Does the Republican Party support the procedures and rights that protect minorities and all Americans? And you can see the Republican Party is way out with the most extreme parties of the populist authoritarian transformation of the world. And the Democratic Party is in the mainstream here. And the other thing I'm going to point out for a second is part of the way in which the Republican Party continues to compete is that it's become the home for people with high levels of hostility to outgroups, whether those groups are defined ethnically or religiously or in terms of sexuality. That's what the Republican Party is mobilizing, and why it's drifting so far to the right, and how it's trying to continue to be electorally viable, despite the fact that the share of voters that support it is shrinking. And then I'm going to add one more piece to the puzzle and then open things up for discussion. I'll go into this in more detail next week. But I think one of the things that we have to be honest with ourselves about in terms of the limits of the American Constitution and the way it structures our practice of democracy is that we amplify the power of minorities. We do that through the Senate and the equal representation of the less populous states. We do it within the Senate through things like the filibuster that allows a minority of the minority to block legislation supported by large majorities. We do it with the office of the presidency and its veto power, with the Supreme Court and its veto power, with the Electoral College and with federalism. All of these institutions favor a party like the Republican Party that does not represent the ideological or the racial diversity of the United States. And so if we really want to fix the deadlock in Congress right now, if we really want to let the United States continue to function as a leader in the world in a very dangerous time, my suggestion to you is that we don't just need to be thinking about how in the world do we get Jeffries and the Republicans to work together to come up with some consensus leader of the House. Yes, we need that. But we also need to start thinking about repairing democracy in the United States. That's where I want to take you in coming weeks. I'll stop there. I know I threw a kitchen sink worth of material at you today. Who wants to pick up a pot out of the sink and start discussing it? We've got Israel, we've got the Ukraine, we've got the House, we've got Trump's legal troubles, and we've got the issue of American democracy. Nothing worth discussing there? I'll go have my lunch if you want me
David,
to. Yeah, go ahead, Bob.
On your later points about the need to change the basics of our system so that it's not so representative of minority rule. That sounds to me like an awfully difficult thing to do. I mean, there's so many entrenched forces that are saying, oh, no, we like the way it is. And, you know, in every corner, that's where they are. And I'm not sure at all that we have any chance of whatsoever of doing that.
Yeah, we can't even get a Speaker of the House. How in the world can we reform our Constitution?
Yeah,
I hear you loud and clear, Bob. And I do want to address this more systematically in coming weeks. But I'll say two things, one of which I think you've heard me say before, which is that if you look at history, sometimes it's really hard to detect the possibility of transformative change until it's right on top of you, right? And so there are many historical moments where things look very bleak, and lo and behold, a decade later, things are entirely different. And so the New Deal in the United States, the Civil Rights Revolution in the United States, the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, the collapse of Soviet communism in Russia, those were all, I think, and I think I've shared with you before, maybe, that I was in the Czechoslovakia, as it was called, in 1989. And I was there with a whole bunch of literature from Václav Havel. Nobody would take it off my hands. Nobody wanted it. They would come over to my apartment and read it. They didn't want to speak with me on the phone in English because they thought it would call the Secret Service to their doorstep. Little did they know that 6 months later there would be a velvet revolution and the communists would be out of power, right? And so sometimes radical change is hard to see. But having said that, that doesn't mean we just kind of hope that maybe we're closer to radical change than it actually appears we are. We have to organize. We have to begin to strategize. We have to think about, for instance, a constitutional convention and how hard that would be right now, given where we are as a society, how polarized we are, given the diminished faith in democracy in a large portion of our population. Yes, there are real obstacles. And so one of the questions is, what's the first step? What's the second step? What's the third step? If we're interested in a long-term strategy, as opposed to being defeated by the improbability of change, or being completely utopian and just saying, well, let's start thinking about the good ideas and hope somehow they'll come to pass, we need to be strategic. We need to be organized. We need to be political. We need to start pursuing a patient path. That's what, for instance, the NAACP began to do at the beginning of the 20th century that eventually bore fruit in the middle of the 20th century. I hope that opens up at least a glimmer of hope, Bob. I'll get to more detail when we get further along. David, go ahead. You're still muted.
Yeah.
There you go.
I know that this is altogether too utopian, but it strikes me that given the developments in the two-party system over the last 30 years, since the early 90s, when it all sort of started to fall apart, that we'd be better off with a parliamentary form of government rather than a two-party system, which I don't know which came first in this country, the Constitution or the two-party system. Were we always two parties even in the very earliest days? But it just strikes me that a parliamentary system of government can sort of survive the ebb and flow of these ideological realignments and the like better than we can, as evidenced by the fact that even countries with 5 or 6 parties end up having at least stable governments for short periods of time.
Well, so David, I hear you to say that you believe that we need a multi-party system in the United States, and that you worry that a presidential system is hostile to a multi-party democracy. And I'm not sure that I agree with the second proposition. And that doesn't mean that I disagree that parliamentary systems tend to have coalition governments and greater numbers of parties present in parliament and then cooperating with each other. But that's in part because of the way they structure their electoral systems as well. And this is precisely what I want to start talking with you about, which is the idea of multi-member districts. And one of the things I like about the idea of multi-member districts for the House of Representatives is that they, on the one hand, get rid of gerrymandering. On the other hand, also get rid of primaries if they're structured correctly, which is one of the factors that's producing ideological extremism in American politics. And they open the door for multi-party competition. But perhaps most importantly, they don't require constitutional amendment. They require ordinary legislation at the state level. And so the blocking mechanism on reform, when we're going to get into this, is that the United States is a country with perhaps the most difficult constitution to amend in the democratic world, and the oldest constitution in the democratic world. So in a sense, the one that seems to have the most that needs to be amended, right? And so we face a real conundrum there. We're back to Bob's worry that this is going to be really hard to do. And I don't doubt that.
Well, I don't deny that it's going to be hard to do. The only problem I have with your formulation, which I think is pretty sensible, is it doesn't get rid of the Senate. And as long as the Senate is there, we're going to represent land and we're going to represent minorities. And anytime that South Dakota has as many representatives in the Senate as California, we have that problem.
Yeah, and I completely agree with you. And there's no way around that without constitutional amendment. And please note that that portion of the Constitution doesn't just require 2/3 of both houses and 3/4 of the states. It requires unanimity on the part of the states to remove equal representation in the Senate. And therefore, the states that are currently underrepresented, proportionately speaking, have to figure out some way to generate leverage over the states that are disproportionately overrepresented, right? And again, I think this will require time. This will require strategy. This will require energy. I do think that the simple thing you do in the 2020s is you propose and advocate for and organize for DC and Puerto Rico and maybe Guam statehood, right? And so you expand the number of states that tend to mirror the politics of the larger states that are currently handicapped in the Senate. But yes, you're right. It is an entirely different ball of wax, and it doesn't get solved by having multi-member districts electing the House.
Well, getting rid of the filibuster, which is not constitutional, is a possible step in the right direction. But
Agreed. And there are lots of rule reforms in the Senate and the House that would make our politics a little bit more responsive. You're kind of asking me to get ahead of myself, right? I've got weeks to think about this. By the way, one of the things I want to think about is relocating some of the locus of action around legislation out of the House and the Senate and into alternative fora of deliberation and lawmaking. I think that technologically, the idea of citizens' juries and other deliberative bodies or decentered forms of decision making that have opened with technology that are being used in other places is a really productive thing for us to be thinking about. Again, we can do it without constitutional amendment, and we can do it in ways that might both reanimate some of the attention on policy details on the part of ordinary citizens and restore some accountability to our government. All right, everyone. Wonderful being with you again. Flossie, do you have something you want to say? Go ahead. You got to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes, you've done it.
Can you add to your reading list a book by J.D. Vance called The Hillbilly Elegy?
I can add it to the list of. Go ahead.
J.D. Vance, The Hillbilly Elegy. Can you just take a look at that book?
I've already read it, Flossie.
Yes. Have you heard of it?
I've already read it.
Okay, tell me if there is some connection between Mr. Vance's book and the Tea Party people.
Well, how about J.D. Vance? Do you know that he's now a member of the
Okay,
Senate?
you said it. We take it away. That's it. Happy.
Okay. All right. I see where you're going, and you're absolutely right. I mean, in J.D. Vance, I'm not a huge fan of that book, but at least I think it's an interesting book to engage with. J.D. Vance has become pure Make America Great Again Republican in order to get into power, right? I mean, and that does seem to be one of the things that is happening in the Republican Party right now. In a sense, Hillbilly Elegy gives us an indication of some of the impetus for this movement. But then there are a whole bunch of people who, rather than analyzing and addressing the sources of grievance, just want to inflame them. And J.D. Vance seems to have made that change himself. All right, everyone. Great being with you. Be well, take care. And I will see you all next week to continue the conversation. Let us hope that the news of the coming week is a little better than the news of the past week has been. Take care, be well. See you next week, everybody.
Thank you.